Bob Hood. I'm the Director of Tourism for Gallia County, and I was 5 years old at the time of the bridge collapse.
What do you remember from the collapse?
Well, my mother was a nurse, and what I remember vividly on the evening of the collapse was that my mother was to report to the hospital, which was several blocks away there, and she was to care for the injured and for those that had been injured in the collapse. So I remember my grandmother walking over to our house and staying with us as a family. My father was in the retail clothing industry, and he was working at the time, so it took him a little bit of time to get the store closed down and to get over to our house where he could be a father to his kids. So I remember specifically the total confusion in the community. There was absolutely no phone service. Of course, there was nothing like cell phones, but we could not get in contact with hardly anyone because the phone lines were all tied up from people wanting to know, trying to reach their loved ones. So I remember it being totally mass confusion within the community. I also vividly remember going to bed that evening and listening to a little portable transistor radio, and they were broadcasting live from New York, and they were talking about what would now probably be CNN or something like that. They were broadcasting world news, and they were talking about the collapse of a bridge in Ohio spanning the West Virginia-Ohio border. And my thoughts were, as a 5-year-old kid, wow, I cannot believe that we've hit national news here. And so I do remember thinking of it as the big picture there, laying in bed listening to coverage.
Did you know anybody that saw the bridge go down or was on the bridge?
I did not know anyone directly on the bridge. As it turned out, what I remember, another thing that I remember is the spinoff that happened. There were a lot of folks that I knew that had relatives that were on the bridge. I did not know anyone directly or personally that were on the bridge, but I had children that were in my class at school. Their relatives were on the bridge. I had a distant relative of our family that their parents were on the bridge. And our neighbor right across the street, their son was on the bridge. And ironically, he had just finished his day passing the paper for the Gallipolis Tribune, and that was his final day as a paper carrier. And he was leaving for Las Vegas to start a new career. And so I did know people indirectly that were affected, and I also knew people indirectly. And as I've become older, I have come in contact with several people that directly were affected with the loss on the bridge. But I did not know anyone personally, but I knew a lot of people. And I think that was the way that the whole community was. The next time there was church services, every church had services related to that and the disaster. And my mind spins back to what just happened this past couple of weeks in Connecticut. I think the same thing is true. You know, I knew from the very beginning that our communities, the two communities, would really never we would never be able to put the whole issue to bed. It would always be something that would linger in our history. But I truly thought that from that point on, that the whole community was affected. And I just remember that as a child thinking we are going to be forever connected to this story.
Did you hear anything about the Mothman or the Cornstalk curse?
I did. I'm very aware of the Mothman connection. I have counterparts in my job today. I have counterparts in Mason County. The Mothman Festival lingers, and I did go see the movie, and I wanted to see that. I was very interested in how they would portray that, it was very interesting. You know, we're proud to be from Appalachia, and that stigmatism reflected over onto the Mothman, and of course, if you know the history of the bridge, like we know the history of the bridge, you know the real cause and effect, And so for them to paint the picture, of course, anything starring Richard Gere is going to bring people into the theater. But it was sort of a very it was a very misleading story in itself. There are evidences of the Mothman, and there are, if you go to Point Pleasant, I've actually gone in the actual bungalows. I've actually been in there, been underneath the ground there in those areas at the fort, and they are just very. It's very chilling to be there and to think that you're standing in the midst of history there and what could have been. Now, have I gone looking for the Mothman? Absolutely not. But I think it's a good attraction to bring people here. It's a good thread, if you will. But those of us that live here, and those of us that grew up here, and those of us that know history, we know the real meaning behind what happened on that night. And it forever changed bridge inspections. It forever changed the history of the way that bridges would be built. And so we know what really happened.
How did it affect the community?
Well, that's an interesting question because in my job as Director of Travel and Tourism, when we bring in buses and we go after tour buses, and that's one of the things that we go after as Director of Tourism, and we go around the country and meet with tour operators that bring potential visitors here. There's about 3 or 4 questions that are always staged to us when we go to visit tour operators, and one of those questions is always, tell me about the bridge. And when people come here in big numbers, and when they do bring a bus here, I always ask the question, do you remember the night, and do you remember the news story about when the Silver Bridge fell? And most everyone in that bus raises their hand, and most everyone in that bus, of course, we cater to senior audiences. And so most of the people that are on that bus there have a connection or know the place by what happened there. And so how was the community affected? I think it was very solemn because in a tight-knit community as we are, everyone knows every person and everyone knows a little bit about every person. And you asked the question in the beginning, did I know anyone directly? Well, I knew the indirect people, and as I grew up and as I got older, I knew directly the people that were affected. And so the community, it forever was etched in the minds of those people about what happened, and that story lives on and in the lives and in the hearts of those of us who are here. But it changed our community. It changed the way that Point Pleasant was laid out. Of course, it changed them from a retail standpoint. But it changed the way that the community looks at life, I think, because I think they look at life more surreal now, and anything can happen in the midst of time and in the midst of a flash of a second. My father-in-law worked at Goodyear, and his course of path to his occupation was changed. That night, he got off that night. Of course, they knew about the collapse of the bridge at Goodyear. He had worked the evening shift that night. And he had to go to Mason and come home. And then, of course, they had to ferry people back and forth across the river. And several lives were lost in that effort as well later in the story. But I think that, those people had to drive around. People had to make alternate ways to get across the river and back and forth. And for me, as a child, I specifically remember going every Sunday, every single Sunday. I would go up to Cheshire or to the bridge spot there, and I would ride across on a train into Point Pleasant, make a turnaround, and ride back across to Gallipolis, just to see the progress. In the beginning, of course, we were looking at the recovery efforts, and we were looking at the disaster, and we were looking at the remains. And then we began to notice that as they would clean up, and then we began to notice the future construction and the new bridge. So I went there week after week after week, and I would always have the same thing. I would always have a Coke and a package of Neckos. And you can tell by looking, have drinking too much Coke over time and probably eaten too many Neckos. But it was just like, that was the thing to do on a Sunday, was my parents and I, along with a family in Gallipolis, we would go every week and drive across just to watch, in the beginning, the recovery efforts, and then we began to watch the improvements in the building of the new bridge. And I think of myself as a first responder. Every time a major incident happens within the United States, whether that's 9/11, whether that's the Twin Towers, or whether that's the incident in Connecticut that we just witnessed, or whether it's as I reflect back on the Silver Bridge, I think of those first responders that spent days and nights there, hours on top of hours, and those that sat and waited, and I think of the news that had to be given to families, and when you give that news, and I think of the tired efforts of first responders, especially in a community like our size that has a lot of volunteers. Most of our first responders are volunteers, and we would do just like we would on any other incident that we have. We would respond, we would sit, we would wait, we would do what we could. And there's only so much that a first responder can do. And then you have to get back in the car, and you have to come back and do it again. And so my mind always goes to those first responders in communities who put their life on the line, just as our first responders did that night. The sad thing about the recovery was that, my mother came home that night from the hospital very sorrowful with a heavy heart because there was not as many people to be treated as what they had originally thought. A few that survived, got out, and they did have to treat. But in a mass situation like this where we have fatalities, it's heavy, and it's heavy on the community, and you grieve for those that lose loved ones, and you grieve for those that are forever, families who are forever changed. But it changes the whole community from the top to the bottom. You're not expecting things like this to happen, and you realize the frailty of life and the quickness of how things can happen, and so that's how it changed the community.
Do you know if there was any charge? I haven't asked anybody else this. Any charge for the train or the ferry?
There was a charge for the train. I can't answer the question about the ferry, but it was a minimal charge. I think, if my mind recalls, maybe like a quarter. It was very minimal, but I do remember there was a charge because I remember my dad paying that every time, but I think it was very minimal.
I wasn't sure if they did that on public service or not.
I don't know. I don't know about the ferry.
Did you hear any interesting stories from people who may have seen the bridge go down?
I did, as a matter of fact. In fact, several people that I know that I'm directly affiliated with witnessed that. One particular family witnessed that from the Point Pleasant side that I know. They had been shopping there, and they came out of the retail store. They were actually waiting for a person that was on the bridge to come into Point Pleasant, and they actually did happen to see the bridge fall. There was lots of reports about people that were either right over or had just got across or were the last people. In fact, I talked to a gentleman today that knew two male individuals that had left Goodyear, and they were the last car. In fact, the back wheels of their car were still hanging over the departed bridge. So I do know several people that had stories of either being just on or just off, and one particular family did actually witness that.
Anything else you can relate to us?
It's a part of our history that will always be a part of our history. We're proud of where we live, and we are proud to be associated with those people who, for the past 45 years now, have endured the memories. And but we are a tight community, and we stick together. And I think that's why I enjoy living here is the closeness of the community in which we live.